To shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friend, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of Illinois at Chicago's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Commemoration Week 2021, Critical Conversation with Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. My name is Alexis Grant, and I will be one of your co-moderators today. Today, we are coming together as a campus community with my fellow UIC students, professors, staff, alumni, and community partners. I would like to introduce UIC's Chancellor, Michael Emeritus, who has led UIC since March 2015. His responsibilities span far and wide, and he sees UIC as a model of a public urban research institution in this country, located in a most vibrant global city. UIC is an institution that has a significant local and worldwide impact, with an R1 research status, a public medical center, and a federally qualified health clinics, as well as more than 33,000 students, 12,000 faculty and staff, and 16 academic colleges, including one of the nation's largest medical schools and Chicago's first and only public law school. Chancellor Emeritus, like many of us faculty, staff, students, and community members, have high hopes for what we can achieve in the future as we work towards equity and inclusion together. We're going to turn to Chancellor Emeritus. Please refer to the closed captioning during this video.
Thank you, Alexis, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone. Each year, UIC brings together students, faculty, staff members, and community partners to reflect on Dr. Martin Luther King's enormous legacy. As we re-examine his power impact, we evaluate progress and areas where we have fallen short, and we take measure of society's climate in our own community and throughout the nation. So much has happened since we last celebrated the life and legacy of Dr. King. We have faced the worst pandemic in over 100 years. We were confronted with racism in the most profound way, and we have experienced vitriolic political rhetoric tugging at the very fabric that joins us together. During these chaotic times, we cannot forget Dr. King's words reminding us that we must never lose our infinite hope. A hope that looks beyond our current condition to a more perfect union, a hope that is rooted in our fundamental belief that our voices matter. In all of these crises, there is a common thread: the appalling and deeply rooted racial disparities in our society. Health disparities, justice disparities, educational disparities, and economic disparities. Disparities that continue to affect in so many different ways Black communities here in Chicago and across the nation. Disparities that deprive young Black men and women from opportunity. Disparities that have wounded our nation for centuries. In this environment, the power of education can help us maintain our infinite hope. In Dr. King's own words from The Purpose of Education, and I quote, "Education gives one not only power of concentration, but worthy objectives upon which to concentrate." I could not agree more with this sentiment. And I would add that education is the social elevator that can help us eliminate disparities and create a more fair and equitable society. Every day, UIC students and alumni, faculty and staff make significant contributions to social justice in our communities, in organizations, places of worship, and our own classrooms. But as the events of 2020 have clearly demonstrated, we still have a long way to go. Our Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, Mr. X. Tolliver, frequently reminds me that in a commencement address to Oberlin College in 1965, Dr. King told the crowd that the time is always right to do what is right. 55 years later, we're still working to do what is right in addressing educational disparities among our students, as well as partnering with our underserved communities to ensure that they have a pathway to economic security through education. Their struggle to achieve their goals must be our struggle. We're honored today to have been joined by Professor Ibram Kendi, the widely recognized scholar, historian, author, and activist in the study of race and discriminatory policy in the United States. Alexis Grant, a PhD student from the School of Public Health, and Alex Senvillier, the academic advising and program specialist in UIC's Honors College, will introduce Professor Kendi and serve as co-moderators for the discussion that will follow. On behalf of our UIC community, I want to thank you for participating, wish you well, and remind you to do what is needed these days to stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Emeritus. My name is Alex Senvillier. I'm an academic advisor and program specialist here with the UIC Honors College. I'm also a proud two-time alum of the institution, UIC. I have the pleasure, I want to throw it over to my co-moderator, Alexis.
Sure. Thanks. I just wanted to introduce myself for a second here. As the Chancellor said, I'm a PhD student in Community Health Sciences at the UIC School of Public Health. I work as the Community Engagement Fellow for the Collaboratory for Health Justice, a unit within the School of Public Health that works to advance health justice by attending to issues of participation and representation in public health work. I'm also a co-founder of the Black Graduate Student Association and organizer with a Good Trouble Coalition, both of which continue to work for the inclusion and well-being of all students at UIC. After I complete my degree at UIC, I plan to become a professor and continue my research, teaching, and advocacy.
So I guess we should just go ahead and start calling you Dr. Grant already, right?
Not yet.
Now, I also have the pleasure of introducing Emily Jane Steinberg. She's a public listener, visual facilitator, and scribe who works across all sectors and subject matters. Throughout this program, she'll be providing visualization to our critical conversation with Professor Kendi. The final digital piece will be provided to each participant at the end of this event.
Wow, I'm really excited to see what that looks like at the end of our time here together. So now it is my profound honor to introduce our guest this afternoon, Professor Ibram Kendi. Professor Kendi is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University and the founding director of the BU Center for Antiracist Research. He is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a CBS News racial justice contributor. Kendi is the 2020-2021 Francis B. Cashin Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. He is the author of many books, including Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction, making him the youngest ever winner of that award. He also authored 3 #1 New York Times bestsellers, How to Be an Antiracist, Stamped Racism, Antiracism, and You, co-authored with Jason Reynolds, and Antiracist Baby, illustrated by Ashley Lukashevsky. His newest books are Be Antiracist, A Journal for Awareness, Reflection, and Action, and 400 Souls, A Community History of African America, co-edited with Keisha Blain, which will be out in February. In 2020, Time magazine named Kendi one of the 100 most influential people in the world. At this time, UIC welcomes Professor Kendi.
Hey, hello.
Hello. It's great to have you here today.
Of course, it's great to be here.
Thank you for joining us.
So I wanted to start with a recognition of this historical moment. Today, we just inaugurated our 46th president, Joe Biden, and his vice president, the first female vice president, Kamala Harris. And also in our collective minds and hearts today are the ongoing demonstrations against racism and white supremacy nationwide, as well as the COVID pandemic and its disproportionate impact on Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. On Instagram earlier today, you shared that with the inauguration, the work to driving out injustice is only just beginning. So I wanted to ask you, how do we retain hope that structural racism can be combated and the system can be reformed?
first and foremost, let me just say I'm sort of honored to be a part of this, King commemoration, and I think that what's absolutely sort of critical for us to realize is that this system of racism was essentially constructed, and so therefore it can be deconstructed. It was constructed by policymakers out of sort of severe sort of self-interest. It was codified and normalized through racist ideas, and through racist policies. And I think it's important for us to sort of know that and see that and identify those policymakers, policies, and ideas to rid them of this nation and replace them with anti-racist sort of policymakers, policies, and ideas.
Professor Kendi, with insurrection, impeachment, and inauguration, how do we carry forward equality? Dr. Martin Luther King advocated for equality, but not colorblindness. How do we celebrate and nurture difference between racial groups?
I'm happy you asked this, because there's some who believe that those who identify as Black or Indigenous or Latinx or Asian, that somehow that's sort of counterproductive to creating equality or equity or justice, and that we're all human, and so there's only one race, the human race. But I don't think that those folks realize that if we're not identifying by race, then we won't be able to collect racial data. And if we can't collect racial data, then we're not going to be able to see racial disparities. And if we can't see racial disparities, how are we going to see the policies and practices that are behind those disparities? And if we can't see racist policies and practices, then how are we going to ever eliminate them? And so the actual world we would live in would be a world with racial disparities and inequities all around us that we can't even necessarily see definitively, let alone eliminate, which is kind of like the world as it was in March of last year, when you had people calling the COVID pandemic the great equalizer, when at that very moment, Black folks and Indigenous folks were dying and being infected at higher rates.
So what does it look like to celebrate and nurture those differences?
Well, and I think that's another part of it. I think that, to me, what makes humanity beautiful, even what makes the American people beautiful, are those differences, right? And those cultural differences, those aesthetic differences. And I think that what we have to figure out a way to do as human beings is to recognize the biological and behavioral sameness and the cultural and ethnic sort of difference. And what I mean by biological sameness is, we're all the same biologically, and we all behave the same. Human beings love, human beings strive, human beings do, practice all types of human traits, but they do it differently based on their culture, based on their ethnic group. And we have to sort of have an ability to see the simultaneous sameness and difference and appreciate both.
Yeah, it's really great that you say that. Dr. King was a proponent of integration and distinguished racial diversity with inclusion. And I think this is really related. And thinking about, decades later from his speech that was playing right before we started, what is the importance of integrated spaces and safe spaces?
Well, I mean, certainly, if we're going to have a society of different types of folks, then especially at the tables of power, those tables should be fully, and completely integrated. I think that every community, people should have access to those communities. I'm not necessarily a proponent of, and King actually was not a proponent of the complete elimination of Black spaces, right? You know, King was somebody who grew up in a Black community, presided over and preached from a Black church, went to an historically Black, college, and by 1967 was advocating specifically for, Black economic and political empowerment, and so, to me, different groups should necessarily be able to nurture their spaces because that's where their livelihood, their culture sort of emerges from. But that doesn't necessarily mean people have to be barred from it. That doesn't necessarily mean that certain spaces are over-resourced and others are under-resourced. That doesn't mean that when people see a Black space, they automatically imagine that it's dangerous. That doesn't mean that people go into certain Black spaces and steal, literally, and commodify. I think there has to be this mutual sort of respect for spaces and resources, and that then allows for us to be able to enter into different spaces. Like when I enter into Latinx spaces and Indigenous spaces, I learn so much and love so much.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Kendi, universities functions as institutions, businesses, and spaces. What would an anti-racist university look like structurally?
Wow. Where do we even, begin? I think first and foremost, if a university as most universities claim to be, if their focus is on research as well as on teaching, then the structure should be geared towards anti-racist research and anti-racist teaching. So meaning when it comes to anti-racist research, the basic assumption of research is that there isn't anything wrong with any groups of people, and the basic assumption is that if there is a disparity or an injustice, then researchers should come together from different disciplines and fields to be able to figure out the power, the policies, and the practices behind that injustice, and that research also should not just inform more research or should not just inform, other academics. It should inform policy, empower sort of change. And the university should be structured and provide incentives, for that to happen, as opposed to incentivizing scholars to just continuously talk to other scholars and their research when their research could actually be impacting the community. I think in the areas of teaching, in many ways, Black studies, as a discipline which emerged, in the late 1960s, really sought to really rethink how education, or I should say, teaching, was brought to bear. And so I think that that we should recognize that whenever we're teaching a particular historical topic or literature or a phenomenon, that there's likely multiple perspectives that are coming to bear on that same issue. And so we should be trying to inform students, about the ways in which Asian folks are experiencing this issue, or the ways in which queer folks are experiencing this issue, or the ways in which women are thinking about this issue, these multiple sort of perspectives. But ultimately, I think the focus of education or of teaching at an anti-racist university should not be filling heads. It should be teaching students and galvanizing their desire to know. Like, that's what I want my students to walk away with, just in a tremendous desire to know and how to go about knowing sort of more, not necessarily piling on information. I want to teach them how to think and how to know.
And just as a quick follow-up to that and connected to that, how could a university specifically like UIC, with its Centers for Social Understanding, it enjoys diversity through cultural-based student organizations, how can a university like UIC embrace its diversity more and empower and equip its faculty, staff, and students to do anti-racist work?
Well, I mean, I suspect there are folks at UIC that can answer that question, better than I can. But one thing I can say is, obviously, a university like another institution, puts their investments in what they value, and so obviously they would put in their investments in that direction to. But then, secondly, when it comes to the faculty or even students, for the institution to not, if let's say a certain racial group is underrepresented, for the university not to sort of blame those folks who aren't even at the university for why that's the case, that the university looks internally at its own policies and practices and seeks to change them.
Thank you for that. I appreciate how you mentioned investing in those resources and in those systems that will empower and equip the campus community. Over the summer, we saw that there was a student demands letter, and one of the big categories of demands was investing in the students. So there's been some movement in that direction on campus, and we're looking forward to those changes. So shifting our conversation a little bit, in How to Be an Anti-Racist, you described racism as racist ideas reflected in racist actions, that someone could be anti-racist in one moment and racist in another. And some folks were curious to know if in our modern times with cancel culture, what's the level of grace that we should give people who have the capability to do both those anti-racist and racist things in the same day?
Yeah, so I think that there's a different type of person, or I should say that when a person, let's say, does a racist thing, and we point that out to that person, and that person recognizes how they were being racist, and that person seeks to repair the damage that has wrought, I think we should give that person, grace. I think that person is very different from the person who does the same racist thing, and we point it out, and then that person sort of says, no, what I did was not racist, and I'm not racist. And then the next day, the same thing happens. They do another racist thing, and they deny it again, and then they do it the next day, and then they say they're the least racist person there is anywhere in the world. To me, I don't think it's a problem when those folks get canceled on January 20th.
In How to Be an Anti-Racist, Professor Kendi, you wrote about how minorities, including Black people, can be racist and that people need to call it out as well. How did you come to this conclusion?
Well, fundamentally, once you eliminate the construct of not racist, and once you make the case that we're either being racist or anti-racist, then the question for all people, including Black people, is, are we being anti-racist when we're saying Black people are lazy? Are we being anti-racist when we have the power to charge those officers who murdered Breonna Taylor, and we don't? Are we being, anti-racist when we use our power, as mayors to lock up a bunch of Black folks? Are we being anti-racist, when we say that the reason why Black people are dying at higher rates from COVID-19 is because Black people are so lazy and they just don't want to eat right? Is that an anti-racist position? Are we being anti-racist when, as Black folks, we're constantly thinking Black people are the problem, as opposed to white supremacy and racism? And that's the question that I wanted Black folks to start wrestling with. And I think that's why I sort of made that case in the book, because I don't want us to just assume that because we're Black, we're being anti-racist. If there's anything we've learned over the last 40 years, particularly as individual Black folks have rose to positions of power as police officers, as police chiefs, as mayors, as congressmen and women, as senators, it's that just because a Black person is in positions of power does not mean they're going to do what's in the best interest of Black people.
Mm-hmm.
And what are the difference, if any, in calling out racist actions by a Black person, a person of color, or a white person?
So to me, it's just sadder, right? When, you have, let's say a Black cop who not only does he shoot and kill a Black person, but then turns around and claims that he, quote, feared for his life, which then reinforces this idea of Black people as dangerous. And then when he takes off his uniform and he has to face that very racist idea, himself, around other racist cops, which he is then reinforced. So to me, it's just sad that, when you're anti-Black, it actually hurts you. And then I think the other thing is, the reason why it's sad is that you have particularly Black elites, who somehow think that they've escaped anti-Black racism. When some studies show that as you rise on the economic ladder, the more likely you are to face anti-Black racism.
Yeah,
Definitely.
it's a really great point. I want to pause a minute and take a look at our scribe's work here. Amazing. I love this visual depiction. So thinking about, again, this historical moment we're in, and just the rise of these discussions about anti-racism and anti-racist work, I've been seeing a lot of the ways that these discussions and conversations take part in households that have different generations in them. And I was curious to hear your thoughts. What does anti-racist work look like across different generations? And how can those generations work differently or work together?
So I think, to not overly generalize, but I think members of older generations tend to be much more likely to sit in positions of power, as policymakers. And then folks who are more middle age sit in positions as more middle managers. And then folks who are younger aren't middle managers, or certainly people who are executives who have the power to shape policy. And so oftentimes, just as you have young people resisting power more broadly, meaning those policymakers, so too are they resisting within their own families, right? That power sort of embodied. And so I say that to say that I think that it's important for folks who are who are senior, not just in terms of their age, but also their positions, to realize that they have the power to shift policy right now. They have the power to assess, are these policies leading to injustice, to racial injustice, or are they just policies? And to have the courage and the ability to essentially change them, if they're unjust policies. You also have middle managers who are typically charged with carrying out the policies that other folks made. And for those folks to think about ways to thwart those unjust policies they're being asked to carry out. And typically they do it very privately, such that nobody knows. But that's a form of resistance that folks across history have been using. And then the younger folks to continue as they are, organizing together and demonstrating to resist those policies and those policymakers.
Yeah, that's great. I'm not sure of the age breakdown of our viewers today, but I was also curious to hear, what about folks who may be retired and aren't in a workplace and engaging with these policies as often?
So if you're retired, if you have the financial ability to retire, then you likely may have the financial ability to support some of the organizations in your community, in Chicago or elsewhere, that is challenging racism, that's challenging, police violence, that's challenging inequity and disparity. Or if you don't necessarily have the resources and you're living, even though you're retired, but you may have some time on your hands, so you can basically, as many sort of, I know, older, Black folks have done for generations, you can volunteer for many of these organizations, and they can sort of use your wisdom and your energy, in their efforts.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Professor Kendi, the Illinois General Assembly last week passed 2 major reform bills addressing criminal justice and education reform, which is recognized as a huge first step towards addressing systemic issues of race in policy. In your opinion, is our government, state or federal or whatever, is our government making necessary changes to move beyond party lines, or even change how the world thinks about human dignity, essentially rehumanizing folks here in the United States?
I think there are some individuals within some governments who are thinking very deeply about what policies have the ability to eliminate poverty or eliminate voter suppression or, completely reverse climate change. And then you have others who are trying to sort of juggle what they consider to be reforms with their own sort of political considerations and standing, or lobbyists or special interests. And so they're trying to, quote, ensure that they are reelected. And so as a result, they're following sort of, they feel that in order to get votes, they need money. So they're following the money, but then they also are following public opinion, and don't want to sort of do something that it appears that a significant segment of their constituents are against, and they're unwilling to basically convince their constituents that a policy, an unpopular policy, is actually the way to go. And so I think it's at an individual level, which is unfortunate, because what if we had an elected body of folks in your state government, in my state government, in the federal government, who their primary focus was what policies can solve the problems of our time. That's it. Like, they didn't have any other considerations other than that. We would have solved a whole bunch of problems in our communities a long time ago.
Right. Yeah, as mentioned in the beginning, I'm in public health. So all the time we talk about structural determinants of health and thinking about where you live, where you work, what your job is, and all of those sociodemographic factors that impact your health and well-being. And I'm really curious to hear from you. You mentioned the kind of the lobbying and the way our political system is set up. What is the solution to changing the way the system is built?
Well, I mean, for instance, we talked about, one of the adages is, if you need votes, but money gets you votes, then you're going to go after the money. And the reason for that is because largely, in many cases, there's this sort of funding race between candidates, which actually can be eliminated. So we could essentially have all elections publicly financed, in which candidates are barred from fundraising outside of what's provided, by the public sector, which would then eliminate that. Oftentimes our elected officials are severely understaffed because we don't resource them effectively. So then they depend on lobbyists and other special interest groups to literally write bills because they don't have the staffing to do so. We can provide them the staffing and the support to do so they won't have to depend on, on anyone else. And I also think that we can figure out ways to make sure the constituents, the American people, are cognizant of every single thing that their elected official is doing, but more importantly, not doing, for them, as opposed to what these folks are actually saying, which is typically different than what's actually happening.
Yes, I definitely agree. There's a lot of attention during the election cycle with all the speeches and not as much accountability after it's all said and done. So Dr. King and his wife, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, are examples of resilience in America fighting for the rights of others. In one of your Atlantic pieces, you state that no wonder the racist acts won't stop when talking about racist policy and denial of such racism being so commonplace. For our audience members who have read your books and are contributing, learning, and leading in their respective areas and groups here on campus and in their community, how do we know anti-racist policies and ideas are making the shift or improvement? What does that progress or change look like?
I think the beauty is that we can measure it, right? So, for instance, if a community instituted a new policy and that cut in half the number of people who were killed by the police or even cancer, right? We can measure that and track sort of racial data, to see the impact that policies are having. But then we can also be regularly and systematically talking to the people who are in the communities and affected, by these policy changes or shifts or lack thereof, in which there is systematically, in which we're talking to folks to see how they're being impacted, how they're feeling, what life is like for them in that institution, in that community, and assessing that, again, over time. Mm-hmm. And so I think the combination of that sort of data and the real life sort of words of everyday people can allow us to see whether we're making an impact.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Professor Kendi, we have some questions that we've pulled from the audience, and if you'll indulge us, we'd like to make sure that some of their questions get asked as well. I'm going to like to start with one from our YouTube audience. Dolores Weems shared, quote, "Tell the truth and shame the devil. We have to call a thing a thing. Is there ever a reason to be colorblind in this world?"
No, because I don't even know what it even means to be colorblind. And so, no, I mean, I think that when you have a world where racial disparity and inequity is pervasive, to say you don't see, quote, the colors is to say you don't see these inequities, right? And so that then leads to you not seeing this world of racism, all the while you're claiming you're not racist because you're colorblind. It's just, it's just a huge and glaring contradiction.
Mm-hmm. I was actually having a conversation with some fellow students earlier this week. We were talking about health inequities and what are the policy changes that can, lead to hopefully seeing those inequities go away. And one of the students asked, is it better to have a policy that is specific to African Americans or Hispanic or whatever the target of the inequity is, or is it better to have it targeted more on the socioeconomic status? I'd like to get your thoughts on that if you could.
Well, I'm happy you asked this as related to health disparities, because when people ask that question, well, you have some Americans who say, this isn't a racial issue, it's a class issue. Right. Mm-hmm. And so we just need to make economic changes. But then when you look at health disparities, right, you see, for instance, Black pregnant mothers who have college degrees dying at astronomically higher rates than white women who are high school dropouts, right? You when it comes to incarceration data, you see Black men coming from millionaire families who are more likely to be incarcerated than white men coming from working class families. And so what that means is that it's clearly not a class issue, right? It's a racial problem. And so to me, this is very simple. When you have a racial inequity, it calls for a racial solution. When you have a gender inequity, it calls for a gender solution. You have an class sort of inequity, it calls for, an economic solution. I mean, why can't it be that simple? Because it really is.
Right.
Definitely. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, we have a couple more questions from our audience. We have a question that came in from a UIC undergraduate student, Savannah Johnson, who would like to know, you are one of the primary authors and activists at the forefront of the racial justice movement. How are you coping with the pressure from this position? And what is something you wish more people knew about you?
Well, I think in terms of how am I coping, I think that most people probably don't know how much all the different ways that I'm being privately threatened and attacked, and even publicly, discredited. And so it does become difficult to cope with that. But I think I wish, people knew that I'm actually, at a personal level, I'm quite sort of goofy. I think many people think I'm very, very serious, which I am. Obviously, this is a serious issue, but behind the scenes, I, like other Black folks, like other non-Black folks, I'm a person who lives with joy.
That's great to hear.
Another great question from a UIC community member, Tamala Meehan. How would you best suggest navigating moving anti-racist work with an inherently racist system? For instance, juvenile justice or even government?
So when I hear the term inherently racist, I think of two things, and I want to make sure we're on the same page. There are some who argue that our juvenile justice system is inherently racist, and so therefore it will always be racist. And so then how do you navigate within this permanently racist system? And meaning they say it was founded that way. It was established and built on those racist policies. So how could it not always be that way? But when I think of inherently racist, I actually think of more founding, but that doesn't mean it can't be revolutionized. And so how I operate, within a racist space is I'm constantly not surprised when racism shows up. And so I'm sort of on guard, but then again, I'm used to this sort of showing up, but I'm also constantly thinking about how do I change fundamentally this system so that it can be anti-racist. And I think that's what we have to be thinking. We can't just assume because it was founded on racism and white supremacy that it will always be that way.
It's a very hopeful response. So we have a question here also from Ellen Ross, who's a faculty member at UIC, and they ask, how can companies engage in anti-racism work in a way that is authentic and not performative?
I mean, I think that I think companies exist within fields or within industries that where there is all sorts of injustice and inequity. Those companies could be supporting those organizations that are powerfully challenging those racist powers, in policies, and so through its resources, it's really supporting those anti-racism efforts within their specific sector, but then even within their own company, that company is constantly self-assessing and self-critiquing and seeking to transform its ways of sort of operating. And that what that means is a company is not declaring that it is anti-racist. It is fundamentally, striving to be just like an individual.
A follow-up on that, what is the response that the public should have when we see a company that it is being performative?
I don't think we should be surprised. I think that just like you had 2 years ago, some people who just perform and say, I'm not racist, you have companies that perform now and say, I'm anti-racist, and it has really no meaning. But and I think obviously we should challenge them. But the good thing is that if they do make a declaration as such, we can draw out the hypocrisy between what they're claiming themselves to be and what they're actually doing, behind closed doors and in public.
Yeah.
Accountability is key. We have another question from Zulema Ocampo, a graduate student here at UIC. They want to know, what are some self-care tools that you use to stay focused while engaged in your professional career?
So I am a vegan. The first thing I do each day is I sort of exercise, and I also listen to audiobooks. And so I think that combination of sort of food for the mind, in the body, first thing that I do really, I think, sets me on a good path each day. And then I also try to read books before I go to bed. And the reason being is because for me, it really settles my sort of mind and focuses my mind. Because as y'all know, we can be thinking about so many different things when we're trying to get to bed, and it can be overwhelming. And then also I try my best to know when I can and cannot do something. And I just try not to sort of do too much. I try to do what I'm effective at, or what I feel can be helpful, so I don't feel sort of overwhelmed. And then I also try to prevent myself from feeling offended. In other words, as somebody who's Black, who lives in this specific society where anti-Blackness is so pervasive, I try not to take the anti-Blackness personally in a way that it makes me think lesser of myself, or it takes away my joy. And so I think that also helps with my self-care.
That's great that you would say that. As a student, I'm taking notes. I'd like to take a moment and head back over to Emily, our scribe. I know for a lot of folks, a lot of grad students especially, we love doing art and appreciating art when we can.
Definitely.
So we have another question from our YouTube audience. Jared Ploger asks, can you speak to the importance of getting young people involved in local elections and teaching them the art of the need for local election involvement?
Sure. So I think as we've been talking about, what governs us is practices and policies, and those who have the power to erect and change those policies. And typically what governs us the most are local policies that are typically instituted by local officials. And so if you are a young person, or even if you're an older person who doesn't necessarily like the way the rules are set up in your community, and you think that they are oppressive or harmful or unfair in some capacity to you or to people who look like you or people who live near you, then you have the power to potentially change it. In other words, by running for the office of the position that can actually change that very policies or set of policies. And obviously, it becomes harder. It's not something that's easy to do or that's easy to achieve, but it's possible. And I want people to recognize that those possibilities, and take advantage of them.
Yeah, definitely.
So another question from another UIC graduate student, Professor Kendi. Thomas Baker asks, to what extent, if any, do you believe the Biden presidency will improve the overall situation of Black America? And in what ways do you expect improvement?
So I think Black folks are in a particular position because historically we've had folks in power who haven't done what's best for ordinary Americans, and folks who have supported policies that were specifically harming Black folks, or not defending Black folks against racist terror, badged or unbadged. And so to me, President Biden has stated that he is going to root out systemic racism. So we'll see, whether he is essentially going to do that. And he has also claimed that he's going to listen to science, and he's going to do what's best for regular Americans, as opposed to the super rich. So again, we'll see. One thing that I do know is that there are a number of organizations, especially right there in Chicago, as well as across the country, who are going to hold his feet to the fire and hold him accountable to ensure, he's doing what's best for the American people, and certainly doing what's best for the people who got him elected, who are Black people.
Definitely.
We have a question from our YouTube audience again, from Rebecca Loris. She asked, any opinions about how the vaccine rollout plan didn't prioritize Black and Brown communities, even though these groups are disproportionately being affected by COVID-19? I know here in Chicago, we have higher death rates for African Americans, higher infection rates for the Latinx community. So this is very relevant, I'm sure, to a lot of our audience members.
So what's fascinating is that you have people who have said that no race should get preferential treatment for the vaccine because that's discriminating against the other races who would not be. And you've had elected officials who have bought that framework, and therefore have decided not in too many states, if not all states, to think differently about who was getting the vaccine in the initial stages. So in most places, you've had folks who've like, you know what, let's give it to medical workers, let's give it to older Americans, and let's give it to essential workers. And why? Because they've argued that obviously medical workers are on the front line of fighting COVID, and so are, you know, essential workers are critical to the maintenance of our society. But then they've also said it relates to older folks, is that they're dying at greater rates. So and that's true. And I think that older, you know, folks, you know, should receive, you know, vaccines before younger folks. But if that is the case, if that's the justification to give it to older folks, then the same justification can be used to give to indigenous folks and Black folks who are, especially Black folks, who are dying at twice the rate of white folks from COVID-19. And this isn't about giving preferential treatment to a particular race. This is about responding to the existence of racism and racial disparity.
Mm. Yeah. Somewhat related to that, thinking about the STEM fields and disciplines within the university that do research that doesn't directly deal with race in particular, what are some small or big things that a university research lab can ensure that their research is anti-racist?
I think that the number one thing is that are they investigating people as the problem, or are they investigating sort of conditions and policies and systems as the problem? And if they're being anti-racist, then they're studying the latter.
We have one more, maybe time for a few more questions. We have a question from Nina Hike from our YouTube chat. They want to know, how do you address microaggressions in your courses?
I point them out. You know, I think that, you know, as the professor, I just point them out. And I think that that can be a blueprint for what we should be doing in society.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Kendi. Thank you so much for joining us. You are an inspirational author, educator, academic, among many other things, and we thank you for sharing your scholarship, wisdom, and hope with us. I speak for many of the audience members when I say that you inspire ourselves to challenge ourselves and our institutions, and to honor the legacy of Dr. King and build a world better than we can dream. It has been an honor to share this virtual stage with you and have this important conversation. So I'd also like to thank the USC MLK Planning Committee, Creative Digital Services, Emily Jane, as well as the ASL and closed captioning interpreters. Thank you for making this event possible.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexis and Alex. You take care.
So let's shift over to Emily Jane and see our final illustration.
That is awesome. Wow.
I'm excited to have a copy of this.
It's very, very powerful piece. Very powerful.
So Alex, we have some closing announcements.
Yes. First of all, thanks, Emily Jane, for that, for contributing your talents to make this event even more special. Some closing announcements. There will be a follow-up email with a link for viewing this program for 14 days. And you'll also receive more information about the UIC MLK Book Club. There will also be an MLK debrief event on Friday, and winter involvement fairs will also be taking place. UIC will continue these conversations in our programs for Black History Month. And we just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you for all the wonderful and great questions that we received as well. Thank you and have a safe, good evening. Until next time. Bye.
Thank you.